The silence in that courtroom was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I stood there, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the edges of that yellow legal pad, the one I'd filled with my careful handwriting over 3 sleepless nights. When Judge Reynolds nodded for me to continue, I cleared my throat and read the final paragraph of my son's letter. As the last words hung in the air, I looked up and saw her face, my daughter-in-law Jessica, who had screamed at me in the middle of Walgreens just 8 days earlier that I was a manipulative old witch who was poisoning her children against her, now couldn't even look me in the eye. Her attorney's hand was on her arm, but she shook it off, gathered her designer purse, and walked out with her head bowed so low her chin nearly touched her chest. Nobody stopped her. Nobody needed to. The truth had finally done what 2 years of my silence couldn't. I never wanted to be sitting in a family court at 63 years old, fighting for the right to see my own grandchildren. That wasn't supposed to be part of my story. When I pictured my golden years, I imagined holiday dinners where I'd pass down my mother's recipes, weekend visits where I'd teach little hands how to tend a garden, birthday parties where I'd spoil them just enough to make them giggle but not enough to upset their parents. Instead, I found myself in a sterile courtroom, surrounded by strangers in suits who were deciding if I was a danger to my own flesh and blood. How does a grandmother end up here? When does love for your grandchildren become a weapon someone can use against you? But I'm getting ahead of myself. You don't know me yet, and you don't know what drove me to that moment standing in front of a judge with a letter that would change everything. Let me take you back to where it all began, before the courtroom, before the public screaming, before my world shrank down to supervised visits and whispered accusations. I need you to understand what led me to fight back when everything in me wanted to just give up. I promise I'll tell you exactly what was in that letter, every last devastating word of it, but first, you need to know why those words carried the weight to silence the woman who had been determined to erase me from my grandchildren's lives. My name is Margaret Wilson Maggie, to my friends, Mom to my son Daniel, and Mimi to the 3 most precious little ones in my world, Emma, age 7, Jacob, age 5, and little Sophia, just turned 3 when all this started. I've lived in Millbrook, a suburb outside of Chicago, for over 35 years. The same house where I raised Daniel after his father passed away when Daniel was just 10. I can still remember the smell of fresh paint when we first moved in, a soft sage green in the kitchen that I thought would bring us calm during breakfast. I kept that color all these years, touching it up whenever it started to fade. Some things you hold on to, even when everything else changes around you. I'll come back to that kitchen paint later, but becomes important in ways I never could have imagined. Daniel was always my quiet, thoughtful boy. Even after losing his father so young, he maintained this gentle spirit that drew people to him. He worked hard in school, never gave me a moment's trouble, and grew into a man any mother would be proud of. When he brought Jessica home during his final year of college, I remember thinking she was like a bright firework next to his steady flame, beautiful, exciting, and a bit unpredictable. She had this laugh that filled a room, wore these bold colors that seemed to make her glow, and talked about her dreams with such conviction you couldn't help but believe in them too. Mom, Daniel told me that first Christmas Eve she spent with us. I've never met anyone who makes me feel more alive, and I was happy for him, truly, deeply happy. When he proposed to her 6 months later, I helped him pick out the ring, a vintage setting with a sapphire center stone, because Jessica had once mentioned she found diamonds predictably boring. The wedding was everything they wanted: small, intimate, at a converted barn venue with twinkling lights and wildflower centerpieces that Jessica had designed herself. She was studying interior design then, with big plans to start her own business. I remember how she hugged me at the reception, whispered, "I always wanted a mom like you," and I felt my heart expand. My son had found someone who completed him, and I was gaining a daughter. That night I gave them my mother's silver candlesticks as a wedding gift, family heirlooms passed down through generations. "For your future home," I told them, "and for your children someday." Jessica had tears in her eyes when she unwrapped them. "These belong in a family," she said, "and that's what we are now." I'll tell you exactly what happened to those candlesticks later, how they became evidence of something I never saw coming. The first few years were what you'd expect from any young couple finding their way. They lived in a small apartment while Daniel finished his MBA and Jessica worked at a design firm. I visited occasionally but was careful not to intrude. When they announced they were expecting Emma, I offered to help with the nursery but made sure Jessica took the lead. "This is your vision," I told her. "I'm just the helper." She seemed to appreciate that approach, and we spent weekends painting clouds on the ceiling and assembling furniture. Daniel would bring us lemonade and marvel at how well we worked together. "My two favorite women," he'd say, and Jessica would roll her eyes but smile. Those were good days when I believed we were building a foundation that would last. Emma arrived on a rainy Tuesday in April, and I'll never forget the first time I held her. Those tiny fingers wrapped around mine, those alert eyes seeming to study my face. "She knows you're her Mimi," Jessica said from the hospital bed, looking exhausted but radiant. Daniel took a picture of the three of us, grandmother, mother, and daughter, that I still keep on my bedside table. I stayed with them for 2 weeks after they brought Emma home, cooking meals, doing laundry, taking night shifts so they could rest. When it was time for me to leave, Jessica hugged me tightly. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said, and I believed her. I believed we were a family supporting each other exactly as we should. Jacob arrived 2 years later, and little Sophia 2 years after him. Each time, I came to help, but I noticed subtle changes in Jessica's demeanor. With Jacob, she was more confident as a mother but also more specific about how things should be done. "The pediatrician says this is the best way," became a phrase I heard often. With Sophia, Jessica seemed almost reluctant to let me hold the baby. "She's still getting used to her feeding schedule," she'd explain. "Or she's very particular about who holds her." I tried to respect these boundaries, telling myself all mothers develop their own styles and confidence. But I'd catch Daniel watching these interactions with a slight furrow between his brows, though he never said anything in front of Jessica. It was around Sophia's first birthday that I began to notice more significant changes. Jessica started a new design business, focusing on luxury home makeovers, and suddenly, their modest lifestyle transformed. Daniel had a good job as a financial analyst, but Jessica's business took off in ways that surprised everyone. They moved from their starter home to a sprawling 5-bedroom house in Lakewood Estates, the kind of neighborhood with a art house at the entrance and a man-made lake with swans. "Business is booming," Jessica explained when I expressed surprise at the sudden upgrade. "I've connected with some very influential clients." Daniel looked proud but also slightly overwhelmed by the rapid changes. I visited their new home for the first time on Thanksgiving that year. The difference was striking, not just the size of the house, but the atmosphere inside it. Everything was perfectly arranged, magazine-worthy, with hardly a toy in sight despite 3 young children living there. "Where do the kids play?" I asked innocently. Jessica gave me a tight smile. "We have a playroom upstairs. I believe in teaching children that there's a time and place for everything." The dinner was catered. The conversation steered carefully away from any topic that might disrupt the perfect image. Jessica seemed determined to project. When Emma spilled her drink, Jessica's reaction was sharp and immediate. "That's what happens when you're careless," she said, and I saw Emma's little shoulders curl inward. Daniel quickly helped clean up the spill, while I took Emma to the bathroom to dry her dress. "It's okay, sweetie," I whispered as I blotted the fabric. "Accidents happen to everyone." Emma looked up at me with those serious eyes that reminded me so much of Daniel as a child. "Mommy doesn't have accidents," she said in a small voice. "Mommy says accidents are for people who don't try hard enough." The words sent a chill through me. What kind of pressure was this 7-year-old living under? But I was careful not to criticize. Instead, I told her about times when her daddy had spilled things as a child, how we'd laugh and clean it up together. "Even grown-ups make mistakes," I assured her. "That's how we learn." When we returned to the table, Jessica was showing Daniel's sister Amy photos of a recent charity gala she had attended. "The governor's wife was there," she was saying, "and she asked for my card. Can you believe it?" I noticed she had changed Emma's plate and glass while we were gone, erasing all evidence of the mishap. Daniel caught my eye briefly, and I saw something there, a plea, a warning. I couldn't quite tell, but it made me uneasy. That night, as I was getting ready to leave, Daniel walked me to my car. It was the first moment we'd had alone all day. "Mom," he said quietly, leaning against my car door, "I know things seem different. Jessica's been under a lot of pressure with the business taking off. She wants everything to be perfect for the kids." I nodded, choosing my words carefully. "Perfection is a heavy burden," especially for children, I replied. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar from his childhood when he was troubled. We're just finding our balance, he said. The new house, the business, the social obligations, it'll settle down. I squeezed his arm, not entirely convinced but unwilling to push. I'm always here, I told him. For all of you. He hugged me then, holding on a little longer than usual. I know, Mom, that means everything. I didn't know it then, but that conversation in the driveway would be the last normal moment between us. For a very long time. What happened the following month would change everything and set us on the path that eventually led to that courtroom moment. I'll tell you exactly what transpired at the Christmas party that turned me from beloved grandmother to persona non grata in my daughter-in-law's eyes. But first, let me share this. If you ever sense something isn't right with your loved ones, don't ignore that feeling. The price of silence is far too high. I wish I had spoken up sooner about what I was seeing. I wish I had known what was happening behind that perfect facade. Maybe then I could have prevented the pain that was coming for all of us, especially those 3 precious children caught in the middle of an adult's dangerous game. It was December 18th, just a week before Christmas, when Jessica and Daniel hosted a holiday party at their new home. The invitation specified cocktail attire and adults only, which struck me as odd for what had traditionally been a family gathering. In previous years, when I arrived, the house was transformed, a towering 12-foot Christmas tree in the foyer, dripping with crystal ornaments, caterers in black uniforms circulating with trays, a string quartet playing in the corner of the living room. I hardly recognized the place, or the people in it. Daniel greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, but he seemed distracted, constantly scanning the room as if looking for potential problems. Jessica was holding court near the fireplace, wearing a sleek red dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension, surrounded by people I'd never met before. Margaret, you made it, she called out when she spotted me, her voice carrying that performative warmth I was beginning to recognize. She air-kissed my cheeks and immediately turned to the woman beside her. This is Daniel's mother. She's been such a help with the children. The way she said it made it sound as if I were the hired help rather than family. The woman's someone named Vivian, who apparently chaired an important charity board, gave me a quick assessment and an even quicker smile before returning her attention to Jessica. I felt dismissed, categorized as unimportant to the evening's networking objectives. Where are the kids? I asked Daniel when I could get him alone for a moment. He glanced upstairs. With the sitter in the playroom, Jessica thought it would be better if they stayed out of the way tonight. Too many important connections here. There was an edge to his voice I couldn't quite interpret. Can I go up and say hello to them? I asked. He hesitated, looked across the room at Jessica, who was laughing at something a silver-haired man had said, then nodded. Just for a few minutes. And don't mention to Jessica. She's a little stressed about everything going perfectly tonight. I slipped upstairs, following the sound of children's voices to a room at the end of the hall. When I opened the door, Emma spotted me first and ran over with a squeal. Mimi, did you bring cookies? It was our tradition. I always brought homemade sugar cookies for them to decorate. Jacob and Sophia quickly joined the welcoming committee, wrapping themselves around my legs. The sitter, a teenage girl I'd never met before, looked relieved to have another adult in the room. I'm their grandmother, I explained. Just came to say hello. She nodded and returned to her phone, clearly not invested beyond the hourly rate she was earning. I didn't bring cookies today, I told them, settling onto the floor where they were playing, but I promise to bring some next time I visit. We can decorate them together. Emma's face fell. Mommy says you're not coming for Christmas this year. We're going to Aspen instead. This was news to me. Every Christmas since Daniel was born, we had spent the holiday together. Even after he married Jessica, they had always included me in their celebrations. That must be exciting, I managed to say, hiding my hurt. Have you ever seen snow in the mountains? As the children chattered about the upcoming trip, I noticed something concerning. Jacob kept rubbing his wrist, wincing slightly when he moved it a certain way. What happened to your arm, Bavi? I asked casually. He glanced at the door before answering. I fell down. Mummy said I wasn't being careful on the stairs. I gently examined his wrist. It was swollen and showed the beginning of a bruise. Did you see a doctor for this? I asked. He shook his head. Mommy put ice on it and said I'll be fine if I stop complaining. A warning bell went off in my mind. As a retired nurse, I recognized signs of a possible sprain that needed proper attention. When did this happen, Jacob? I asked, keeping my voice light. Yesterday, Emma answered for him. He was running when Mommy told him to walk. She got really mad. The sitter finally looked up from her phone. Mrs. Anderson doesn't like the kids to mention injuries to guests, she said flatly. Says it makes her look like a bad mother. Before I could respond, the door opened and Jessica stood there, her smile freezing when she saw me on the floor with the children. I've been looking everywhere for you, Margaret, she said, her voice artificially bright. There are some people downstairs you simply must meet. Her eyes darted to Jacob, who had quickly hidden his injured arm behind his back. Children, it's past your bedtime. Say good night to Grandma Margaret, Jessica, I said. Quietly, as the children reluctantly said their goodbyes, I think Jacob might have sprained his wrist. It needs to be looked at by a doctor. Her expression hardened for just a moment before the social mask slipped back into place. Oh, we've already handled that. You know how boys exaggerate their little injuries for attention. Come downstairs. The Hendersons are asking about you. She took my arm firmly, guiding me toward the door with more strength than her slender frame suggested. At the threshold, I turned back to look at the children. Emma mouthed cookies with a hopeful smile. I nodded, even though I had no idea when I'd be allowed to fulfill that promise. Something was very wrong in this house, beneath all the glitter and perfection. As we descended the stairs, I made a decision. I needed to talk to Daniel, really talk to him, about what I was observing. But Jessica kept me firmly by her side for the rest of the evening, introducing me to a parade of people whose names I immediately forgot, all while steering conversations away from anything substantial. When the party finally wound down around midnight, I found Daniel in the kitchen, loosening his tie and looking exhausted. Can we talk? I asked quietly. About the kids. He glanced toward the living room where Jessica was saying goodbye to the last guests. Not now, Mom. It's late, and Jessica's concerned about Jacob's wrist. I finished for him. Daniel, he needs medical attention. It could be a fracture. My son's expression changed. A flash of alarm quickly replaced by defensiveness. Mom, we're handling it. Jessica knows what she's doing. His tone made it clear. The conversation was over. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the image of Jacob hiding his injury, of Emma's disappointment about the cookies, of Sophia watching it all with those observant eyes that missed nothing. Something was shifting in that family, something corrosive and concerning. The perfect fuck-up, Jessica maintained, was costing those children something vital: the freedom to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to be honest about pain. And Daniel seemed caught in the middle, unwilling or unable to challenge the narrative his wife was creating. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, drinking tea that grew cold in my cup, weighing my options. If I pushed too hard, I risked being cut off from my grandchildren entirely. If I said nothing, I was complicit in whatever was happening behind that perfect front door. By morning, I had made my decision. I would try one more direct conversation with Daniel, alone, and then decide my next steps. I didn't know then that Jessica had already set in motion events that would make such a conversation impossible. I didn't know that Christmas in Aspen was just the beginning of a systematic campaign to remove me from my grandchildren's lives. 2 days after the party, I tried calling Daniel at work. His assistant said he was in meetings all day. I tried his cell phone straight to voicemail. Finally, I texted him. Need to talk about Jacob's wrist. Dr. Friend says it sounds like a potential fracture. Please call. Hours passed with no response. That evening, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Jessica standing there, alone, her face a mask of cold fury. May I come in? She asked, though she was already stepping past me into the entryway. The scent of her expensive perfume, something with sandalwood and vanilla, filled my small foyer, clashing with the cinnamon candle I'd been burning in the living room. Jessica, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Is everything okay? Is Jacob? She cut me off with a raised hand. Stop. Just stop with the concerned grandmother act. Do you have any idea what you've done? Her voice was controlled but vibrating with anger. I genuinely had no idea what she was referring to. What are you talking about? I asked. She pulled out her phone, thrust it in my face. It was my text to Daniel about Jacob's wrist. You're accusing me of neglecting my child, she hissed. of failing to get him proper medical care. Do you know how that makes me look? Jessica, I'm concerned about Jacob's injury. That's all, I tried to explain. As a nurse, for 30 years, I recognized as a retired nurse, she corrected with a sneer. Who hasn't practiced in what, 5 years? You think you know better than me what my son needs. She paced my living room, her designer boots clicking sharply on the hardwood floors. Let me make something perfectly clear, Margaret. I am these children's mother, not you. You had your chance with Daniel. These are my children to raise as I see fit. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Of course, they're your children. I'm just concerned as their grandmother. Their grandmother, she repeated, turning to face me with an expression I'd never seen before, something close to hatred. Let's talk about that role, shall we? You undermine me at every turn. Cookies when I've specifically talked about refined sugar limits. Stories about Daniel breaking rules as a child when I'm trying to teach discipline. Little comments about how accidents happen when I'm teaching consequences. I was stunned by this interpretation of my normal grandmotherly behavior. Jessica, I would never intentionally undermine you. I love those children. You love the idea of those children. She interrupted again. The idea that you get a second chance at motherhood through them, but they're not yours to shape. And Daniel and I have decided that we need some space from your influence. My heart seemed to stop for a moment. What does that mean exactly? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jessica straightened, assuming the posture of someone delivering prepared remarks. It means we won't be including you in our family gatherings for the foreseeable future. No Christmas, no birthdays, no drop-in visits. Daniel agrees that we need to present a united front on parenting, without your outdated ideas confusing the children. She glanced around my living room with distaste. Maybe in a few months, once the children have forgotten some of your permissive attitudes, we can revisit limited, supervised visits. I felt as if I'd been slapped. Does Daniel really feel this way? I asked, unable to believe my son would agree to cut me out of their lives so completely. Something flickered across Jessica's face, uncertainty perhaps, or guilt, but it was gone in an instant. He's my husband, and we're a team. When it comes to our children, we make decisions together. But she didn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. And that gave me a sliver of hope that perhaps Daniel wasn't fully on board with this extreme position. I think I should hear this from Daniel, I said quietly. Jessica's laugh was brittle, dismissive. You think he doesn't have the courage to tell you himself? That I'm the villain? Forcing this decision. She pulled out her phone again, pressed a few buttons, and held it up. Daniel's voice came through the speaker. Mom's been overstepping. Jess, you're right. We need boundaries. Tell her we need a break. The recording was brief, possibly edited, but it was unmistakably my son's voice agreeing to shut me out of their lives. I must have swayed slightly because Jessica actually reached out to steady me, then immediately withdrew her hand as if touching me was distasteful. This doesn't have to be permanent, she said, her tone softening into something that might have been intended as kindness but came across as condescension. Just until you understand and respect our parenting choices. In the meantime, I've drafted a list of acceptable topics and behaviors for any future contact with the children. She pulled a folded paper from her purse and placed it on my coffee table. Review it, and when you're ready to abide by these guidelines, you can contact us through me, not directly to Daniel, to discuss reintegration into the children's lives. I didn't touch the paper. I couldn't. It felt like a surrender document. A formal acknowledgement that I had done something wrong when my only crime had been loving my grandchildren and being concerned for their welfare. Jessica, I said finally, finding my voice, I think you're making a mistake. Those children need all the love they can get in this world. Cutting out family who care about them isn't protecting them, it's isolating them. Something dangerous flashed in her eyes. That's exactly the attitude that's getting you excluded. You think you know better than me. She moved toward the door, then turned back with her hand on the knob. Oh, and don't try contacting Daniel at work again. I've already spoken with his assistant about redirecting any calls from you. The door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt emptier than it had in all the years since Daniel moved out. I sat down heavily on my sofa, staring at the folded paper on my coffee table. When I finally gathered the courage to open it, what I found was both absurd and chilling. Guidelines for acceptable grandparent interaction. The heading read, followed by a list of 23 rules: no unscheduled visits, no gifts without prior approval, no physical affection beyond a brief hug at greeting and departure, no discussions of the past, particularly Daniel's childhood, no contradicting any statement made by Jessica or Daniel in front of the children, no offering food of any kind, no private conversations with the children, visitation limited to 2 hours monthly, supervised by Jessica or an approved proxy. The list went on, each item more restrictive than the last. This wasn't about boundaries, this was about control, about erasing me as a meaningful presence in my grandchildren's lives. And somewhere in my shock and grief, a small spark of anger began to glow. This wasn't right. Those children deserved better than to lose their grandmother because of one woman's insecurity or need for absolute control. Daniel deserved better than to be manipulated into cutting off his own mother. And I deserved better than to be treated as a threat when all I had ever offered was love and support. I tried calling Daniel's cell phone again that night, and the next morning, and again that afternoon, always straight to voicemail. I left messages reasonable. Messages asking him to please call me back, to talk to me directly. I sent texts that showed as delivered, but remained unanswered. I even drove to his office building, only to be told by security that he was unavailable and had left instructions not to be disturbed. It was as if a wall had been erected overnight, with Jessica as its architect, and my son as both its builder and its prisoner. A week passed, then Christmas came and went, my first in decades without Daniel, without the children. I baked the sugar cookies anyway, decorated them myself, then ended up giving them to my neighbor's family when looking at them became too painful. I kept trying to reach Daniel, each attempt less hopeful than the last. In early January, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing Daniel and Jessica Anderson, formally requesting that I cease harassment through excessive communication attempts and respect their clearly communicated boundaries regarding family contact. The letter referenced possible legal action if I persisted in trying to contact them directly. I sat at my kitchen table, the legal letter placed beside Jessica's list of guidelines, and made myself face reality. This wasn't a temporary cooling off period or a miscommunication that could be easily resolved. This was a deliberate, strategic removal of me from my family's life. And while I could fight it higher, my own lawyer, assert grandparent visitation rights, drag us all through an ugly legal battle, had to ask myself, would that actually help the children? Or would it just deepen the conflict and potentially expose them to more stress? With a heavy heart, I decided to step back temporarily. Not to give up, but to give the situation space while I figured out my next move. I wrote one final letter to Daniel, sent to his work address by certified mail, so I would at least know if he received it. In it, I expressed my love for him and the children, my willingness to work through whatever concerns Jessica had about my role as a grandmother, and my hope that we could find a way forward as a family. I emphasized that I would respect their space for now, but that my door and heart remained open whenever they were ready to reconnect. I enclosed a small photo album. I had made pictures of Daniel as a child, of our family traditions, of the early days with each of my grandchildren, so they remember. I wrote in the inscription, "So you remember." The return receipt came back signed, not by Daniel but by his assistant. I never received a response to the letter. Never knew if the photo album made it into his hands or was intercepted by Jessica and disposed of. Winter turned to spring, and spring to summer. My attempts at contact became less frequent but didn't stop entirely. Once a month, I sent a card to each child for their card wall, something Emma had mentioned they kept in the playroom. Simple cards with age-appropriate messages, nothing that could be construed as undermining parental authority. Most likely, they never reached the children. But it helped me feel connected to send them, to put my love into words even if they went unread. In August, nearly 8 months after Jessica's visit to my home, I ran into my neighbor Lisa at the grocery store. Her daughter attended the same private school as Emma and Jacob. "Oh, Margaret," she said when she spotted me, her voice dropping to that tone people use when delivering bad news. "I've been meaning to call you. I saw Daniel yesterday at school registration, and he looked, well, not good, thin, stressed." Jessica was being very public with her opinions. She hesitated. "The thing is, everyone was talking about it afterward. Apparently, there's been a lot of drama with them at school events. Jessica making scenes, Daniel looking embarrassed. I thought you should know. My heart ached for my son. Whatever was happening in that marriage clearly wasn't healthy, and I worried about the impact on the children. Thank you for telling me, I said sincerely. I haven't been able to see them for a while. Family. Complications. Lisa squeezed my arm sympathetically. These things have a way of working themselves out, she said, though we both knew such platitudes rarely proved true. As we parted ways, she called after me, "Oh, I almost forgot the school's Grandparents' Day is coming up in September. It's open to all family. No special invitation needed. Just thought you might want to know." That casual mention was the first real opportunity I'd had in months to potentially see my grandchildren. The school's Grandparents' Day was specifically designed to welcome extended family into the classroom, a chance for children to show off their work and introduce important people in their lives. I marked the date on my calendar, September 15th. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I spent the weeks leading up to Grandparents' Day in careful preparation. I didn't want to cause a scene or create tension for the children, but I also couldn't miss this chance to see them, to let them know I hadn't abandoned them. I chose my outfit carefully, conservative but cheerful, a blue dress I knew Emma had once complimented. I brought small, school-appropriate gifts, bookmarks with encouraging quotes for each child. Nothing that could be interpreted as undermining parental authority. Nothing that would give Jessica ammunition. The morning of September 15th arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze, a perfect early fall day. As I drove to Lakewood Academy, I rehearsed what I would say if I encountered Jessica. Calm, respectful, focused on the children's experience rather than our conflict. I parked in the visitor's lot, noticing with relief that I didn't recognize Daniel's car or Jessica's sleek SUV among the vehicles. Perhaps I could have a few precious moments with the children before any confrontation. The school's main hall was bustling with elderly couples in their Sunday best, clutching coffee cups and program booklets, beaming with grandparental pride. I checked the posted classroom assignments and made my way to Emma's second-grade room first. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I maintained my composure as I entered the cheerfully decorated classroom. Children were leading their grandparents around to different stations, showing off projects and introducing them to teachers. And there she was, my Emma, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing a plaid uniform jumper. She was explaining a science project to an older couple I didn't recognize. Jessica's parents, I realized with a start. They had flown in from California for the event. Emma glanced up, saw me standing in the doorway, and froze mid-sentence. For a terrible moment, I feared she wouldn't remember me or, worse, had been told negative things about me. But then her face broke into a radiant smile, and she dropped her grandparents' hands to race toward me. "Mimi," she cried, throwing her arms around my waist. "You came. I told everyone you would, but Mom said you were too busy." The pure joy in her voice nearly undid me. I hugged her back, careful not to crush her but unwilling to let go too quickly. "Of course I came," I said, blinking back tears. "I wouldn't miss seeing your work for anything in the world." Over Emma's head, I met the curious gazes of Jessica's parents. They looked uncomfortable, but nodded politely. Clearly, they had been told something about my absence from family events. But whatever story Jessica had spun, they seemed unwilling to create a scene in a classroom full of children and teachers. Emma pulled back, her face serious. "Are you still mad at us?" she asked in a small voice. "Is that why you never come over anymore?" The question broke my heart. "Oh, sweetheart, no," I assured her. "I've never been mad at you. Never. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated feelings to work through, but my love for you has never changed. Not for one single minute." She seemed to accept this explanation, her smile returning as she tugged my hand. "Come see my volcano project." And I wrote a poem that got a gold star. For 20 precious minutes, I was just a grandmother again, admiring artwork, listening to enthusiastic explanations of classroom activities, meeting Emma's teacher, who seemed pleased to put a face to a name she'd obviously heard. "Emma talks about you all the time," she confided when Emma was distracted by another display. "About the cookie decorating and the bird watching in your backyard. It's clear you're very special to her." I thanked her, too emotional to say more. Jessica's parents maintained a polite distance, neither approaching nor objecting to my presence. I took that as a positive sign perhaps. They weren't fully aligned with their daughter's extreme position. As the classroom visit wound down, I knew I needed to try to see Jacob in his kindergarten room before my luck ran out. I said a temporary goodbye to Emma, promising to visit Jacob next, and headed down the hallway. I had just entered Jacob's classroom when I heard Jessica's voice, loud and confrontational, coming from the hallway behind me. "Where is she?" Emma said she was here, in my children's school. Jacob spotted me before I could decide whether to stay or retreat. "Mimi," he shouted, running toward me with the same enthusiasm Emma had shown. I knelt to embrace him, my back to the door, savoring what I knew might be our last moment together for some time. "Margaret Wilson." Jessica's voice cut through the classroom chatter. Every head turned. Jacob tensed in my arms, his little body suddenly rigid with anxiety. I gave him one last squeeze before standing to face whatever was coming. Jessica stood in the doorway, her face flushed with anger, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head. "How dare you show up here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but intensely furious. "After everything we discussed, it's Grandparents' Day," I said simply, maintaining the calm I had practiced. "I'm their grandmother." Several nearby actual grandparents shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension but unsure whether to intervene. Jacob's teacher approached, her expression concerned. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Anderson?" she asked. Jessica straightened, aware of the public setting and the impression she was making. "Everything's fine, Ms. Patel. A family misunderstanding. My mother-in-law was just leaving." Jacob clutched my hand. "But Mimi just got here," he protested. "I want to show her my drawings." Jessica's expression hardened. "Jacob, go back to your desk now. Grandma Margaret has to go." The command in her voice was unmistakable. Jacob's fingers slowly uncurled from mine, his eyes downcast as he obeyed. My heart shattered watching him retreat, shoulders slumped in disappointment. "Please," I said quietly to Jessica, "don't punish him for being happy to see me." Something flickered across her face. Perhaps recognition of how this looked to the teachers and other families watching the interaction. She took a step closer, her voice for my ears only. "You're manipulating this situation to make me look like the villain. I will not have it. Leave now, or I'll call security and have you removed for unauthorized access to my children." Before I could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind Jessica. "That won't be necessary." Daniel stood in the doorway, looking exhausted and tense. Jessica spun around, clearly surprised by his appearance. "Daniel, you said you couldn't get away from work." There was accusation in her tone, as if his presence was a betrayal. "I changed my mind," he replied, his voice flat. "It's Grandparents' Day, after all." His eyes met mine, and I saw something there I hadn't expected, not anger, but a profound weariness, and perhaps a flicker of apology. "Daniel," I began, but Jessica cut me off. "We're leaving," she announced. "All of us." Now, she moved toward Jacob, who had been watching the exchange with wide, worried eyes. "But Mom," he protested, "I didn't get to finish showing my pictures to everyone." "Now, Jacob," she repeated, her tone brooking no argument. She took his arm, perhaps a bit more firmly than necessary, and I saw him wince slightly. The same arm that had been injured at Christmas. I realized with a chill. "Jessica," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let go of his arm." The command seemed to surprise everyone, including Jessica. She released Jacob immediately, but her expression was thunderous. "We need to talk," she told Daniel, then turned to Jacob's teacher. "We have a family emergency. Please excuse us." Without another glance at me, she swept out of the classroom, clearly expecting Daniel and Jacob to follow. Daniel hesitated, torn between following his wife and acknowledging me. "Mom," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "I'm sorry about all this. It's complicated." I nodded, understanding flowing between us, despite the inadequate words. "I love you," I told him simply. "All of you. That hasn't changed." He swallowed hard, then turned to follow Jessica, gently guiding Jacob with a hand on his shoulder rather than his arm. As they disappeared down the hallway, Jacob's teacher approached me. "Mrs. Wilson," she said tentatively, "I don't mean to pry, but is everything all right with Jacob at home?" The question confirmed my worst fears. Others had noticed something concerning too. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly. I haven't been allowed to see the children much lately. Miss Patel's expression was troubled. I see. Well, just so you know, we take our students' welfare very seriously here at Lakewood. All of our staff are mandated reporters. She emphasized the last two words meaningfully. If we observe anything concerning, we have protocols in place. I thanked her for her vigilance, grateful that at least the children had watchful eyes on them at school. As I drove home from Lakewood Academy that day, my emotions were a turbulent mixed joy at seeing Emma and Jacob, heartbreak at missing Sophia, who was still in preschool, concern about what I'd witnessed in Jacob's reaction to his mother, an annoying worry about what was happening in that household behind closed doors. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the events of Grandparents' Day would accelerate a crisis that had been building for months. I also couldn't have anticipated that my next encounter with Jessica would occur not in a school hallway or family gathering, but in the pharmacy aisle of Walgreens, with consequences that would eventually lead us all to that courtroom where this story began. Sometimes the breaking point comes not in the big moments, but in the small, everyday places where our guards are down and truth finds its way to the surface. For us, that place would be Walgreens on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, just 8 days before I would stand before a judge with a document that would change everything. 2 weeks after the Grandparents' Day incident, I was picking up a prescription at the Walgreens on Maple Street. It was a routine errand on a dreary day, the kind of mundane task that fills retirement when family gatherings no longer occupy your calendar. I was standing in the pharmacy line, flipping through a magazine without really reading it, when I heard a child's voice that stopped my heart. Look, it's Mimi. Sophia, my littlest grandchild, was pointing at me from a shopping cart being pushed by Jessica, who was distracted, talking on her phone while examining something on a shelf. Sophia, I gasped, moving toward them without thinking. At 3.5, Sophia was taller than when I'd last seen her, her blonde curls longer, but her delighted smile was exactly the same. Jessica looked up at Sophia's exclamation, her phone conversation cutting off mid-sentence when she saw me. What are you doing here? She demanded, as if I'd orchestrated this chance meeting in a public pharmacy. Picking up a prescription, I said simply, my eyes still on Sophia, who was bouncing excitedly in the seat of the cart. Hi, sweetheart, I said to her, restraining myself from reaching out to touch her cheek. You've grown so much, Sophia beamed. I'm 3.5 now, she announced proudly, and I can count to 20 and write my name. Jessica moved the cart back slightly, creating distance. We have to go, she said curtly. Say goodbye, Sophia. But Sophia wasn't ready to say goodbye to the grandmother she hadn't seen in nearly 9 months. Mimi, I drew a picture of you, with your cookies and your birds. She twisted in the cart seat, trying to maintain eye contact as Jessica began wheeling her away. And Daddy said maybe we could. That's enough. Sophia, Jessica interrupted sharply. We're leaving now. Something about the joy in Sophia's voice, the innocent mention that Daniel had discussed me with her, the realization that I was still part of their family narrative despite Jessica's efforts to erase MIT, broke through my careful restraint. Jessica, I said, following them down the aisle, please, can we talk, just for a minute, about the children? Jessica increased her pace, but the store was crowded, forcing her to slow down near the vitamin display. There's nothing to discuss, she said over her shoulder. The boundaries were clearly established. Sophia was looking back and forth between us, confusion clouding her little face. Why is Mommy mad at Mimi? She asked, and the simple question seemed to ignite something in Jessica. She spun the cart around to face me, her expression livid. Because Mimi doesn't respect Mummy's rules, she said, speaking to Sophia but glaring at me. Because Mimi thinks she knows better than Mummy about everything. That's not true, I said, quietly aware we were gathering attention from other shoppers. I just miss the children. I love them. That's all. Jessica laughed. A harsh sound, nothing like the warm laughter I remembered from earlier years. Love, is that what you call it? Undermining me at every turn, questioning my parenting, showing up at their school against our explicit instructions. Her voice was rising, her control slipping. Jessica, please. I glanced around at the curious onlookers. Let's not do this here. But something had broken loose in her. Some dam of fury that couldn't be contained. No, let's do it here, she insisted, her voice now loud enough that a store employee was moving cautiously in our direction. Let's tell everyone how the perfect grandma Margaret has been trying to poison my children against me. How she thinks I'm not good enough for her precious son or her precious grandchildren." Sophia began to cry, frightened by her mother's outburst. I instinctively moved to comfort her, but Jessica blocked me with her arm. "Don't touch her," she nearly shouted. "Don't you dare touch my child." The store employee, a young man with a concerned expression, had reached us. "Ma'am," he addressed Jessica, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. You're disturbing our customers." Jessica rounded on him. "Do you know what this woman has done? She's stalking my family, following us to stores, showing up at my children's school." The young man looked uncomfortable but stood his ground. "That may be, ma'am, but this isn't the place to address it. If you feel unsafe, I can call the manager or security." Jessica seemed to suddenly realize how she appeared a well-dressed woman screaming at an elderly lady in a pharmacy while her child sobbed in a shopping cart. She took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and when she spoke again, her voice was controlled but ice cold. "You're a manipulative old witch," she said to me, just loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "And you're poisoning my children against me. Stay away from my family, or next time, it won't be store security I call." She turned the cart sharply and strode toward the exit, leaving her shopping basket abandoned on the floor. Sophia looked back at me, tears streaming down her face, one small hand reaching out until they disappeared through the automatic doors. I stood there, shaking, as whispers circulated among the witnesses to the scene. The store employee touched my arm gently. "Are you okay?" "Ma'am, do you need to sit down?" I nodded gratefully, and he guided me to a bench near the pharmacy counter. "Would you like some water, or should I call someone for you?" I declined both offers, assuring him I just needed a moment to compose myself. What I really needed was to understand what had just happened: the disproportionate rage, the paranoid accusations, the complete loss of control in a public setting. As I sat there, trying to process the encounter, an older woman approached and sat beside me. I couldn't help overhearing. She said quietly, "I'm Diane Keller. I used to work as a school counselor at Lakewood before I retired last year." The name of my grandchildren's school caught my attention. "I don't know your situation," she continued, "but what I just witnessed, it concerns me. That level of public volatility often indicates more serious issues at home." She hesitated, then added, "Those children in your family, are they safe?" The question hit me like a physical blow because it articulated the fear that had been growing in my mind for months. Were my grandchildren safe with a mother whose anger could explode so violently over a chance encounter, whose control was so important to her that she would cut off family relationships, create elaborate rules, and publicly humiliate both her child and an elder? "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I've been kept away from them for almost a year now." Diane nodded sympathetically. "Family estrangement is difficult enough, but when there are children involved and behavior like what I just saw." She pulled a business card from her purse and pressed it into my hand. "This is the contact information for family services in our county. They have resources, legal advice, mediation services, and if necessary, ways to report concerns about children's welfare, just in case you need it." I tucked the card into my wallet, thanking her for her kindness to a stranger. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying the scene at Walgreens over and over in my mind. Jessica's words, "manipulative old witch, poisoning my children against me," echoed in my thoughts. But it was the fear in Sophia's eyes that truly haunted me. My grandchildren were living with a mother whose emotions could spiral out of control, who seemed to view normal grandmother-grandchild affection as a threat, who spoke about poisoning and manipulation in front of a 3-year-old. And Daniel, where was he in all this? Why wasn't he protecting the children from this instability? The next morning, I made a decision. After nearly a year of respecting boundaries that seemed increasingly designed to isolate rather than protect, it was time to take more direct action, not out of vindictiveness or a desire to punish Jessica, but out of genuine concern for 3 children caught in what appeared to be an increasingly volatile situation. I called the number on Diane Keller's card and scheduled an appointment with a family services counselor for the following day. The counselor, a woman named Marianne Fletcher, listened attentively as I described the history: Jessica's gradual isolation of the family, the controlling behaviors I'd observed, Jacob's untreated injury, the explosive incident at Walgreens. "What concerns me most," I concluded, is that I haven't been able to speak with my son alone in nearly a year. Every attempt at communication goes through Jessica, and the few times I've seen him, he seems diminished. Somehow, not the Daniel I know. Marianne nodded thoughtfully. What you're describing contains several red flags for controlling behavior that could be harmful to children. However, she added carefully, as a grandparent with limited recent access, your observations may not be sufficient on their own for intervention. Do you have any other family members or friends who have witnessed concerning behaviors, teachers, neighbors, anyone who could corroborate your worries? I thought about Ms. Patel, Jacob's teacher who had asked about his welfare, about Lisa, my neighbor who had mentioned drama at school events, about Jessica's parents, who had seemed uncomfortable but not hostile at Grandparents' Day. Yes, I said, there are others who have noticed things, and there were witnesses to the Walgreens incident. At least a dozen people saw her behavior. That's helpful, Marianne said, making notes. Here's what I suggest as next steps. First, document everything you've observed, dates, times, specific behaviors, witnesses, if any. Second, consider pursuing legal advice about grandparent visitation rights in our state. And third, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. If you truly believe the children are at risk, you can file a formal report with Child Protective Services. They're required to investigate any credible concern about child welfare. The thought of involving CPS sent a chill through me. It felt like crossing a line, like an irrevocable escalation that would forever change my relationship with Daniel and Jessica. Would they know it was me who reported? I asked. Marianne explained that reports could be made anonymously, but that the nature of the concerns might make it obvious who had raised them. This isn't a decision to take lightly, she advised. But if your primary concern is the children's safety and well-being, sometimes difficult choices have to be made. I left the meeting with a heavy heart and a folder full of resources, legal referrals, documentation guidelines, support group information for estranged grandparents. As I drove home, my phone rang an unfamiliar number with our local area code. Pulling into a parking lot, I answered cautiously. Margaret, it's Rachel Patel, Jacob's teacher from Lakewood. Her voice was hushed, as if she was calling from somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the emergency contact form from last year, before it was updated, of course, I said, my pulse quickening. Is everything all right? Is Jacob okay? There was a pause. That's why I'm calling, she said finally. Since Grandparents' Day, there have been some incidents that concern me professionally. Jacob has become withdrawn, his work is suffering, and yesterday, she took a deep breath. Yesterday he came to school with a bruise on his cheek. When I asked what happened, he said he made Mommy mad by talking about his Mimi at dinner. My blood ran cold. Did he say what happened? Did she hit him? Miss Patel was quick to clarify. He said he fell against the counter when his mom was being loud. Mrs. Wilson, I'm a mandated reporter, which means I'm required by law to report suspected abuse or neglect. I've documented my observations and shared them with our school counselor, but I thought you should know as well, especially since. She hesitated again. Jacob mentioned that Emma tries to protect him and Sophia when their mom gets scary mad. By the time I hung up with Miss Patel, my decision was made. This wasn't about my relationship with Jessica anymore, or even my access to my grandchildren. This was about 3 children potentially living in fear in their own home. I called Marianne Fletcher back and told her I wanted to file a report with CPS. I need to do this formally, with my name attached. I explained, these are my grandchildren. I won't hide behind anonymity when their safety is at stake. Next week was a blur of meetings, paperwork, and anxiety. I met with a CPS caseworker named Kevin Ramirez who took my statement, reviewing the timeline of my observations and concerns. I provided contact information for Ms. Patel and others who might have relevant insights. We take all reports seriously, Kevin assured me, especially when they involve multiple indicators and potential witnesses. We'll conduct a thorough assessment, which typically includes a home visit and interviews with family members, including the children, if appropriate. I braced myself for the fallout, knowing that when Jessica discovered I had initiated a CPS investigation, any hope of reconciliation would likely be destroyed. But I kept reminding myself, this isn't about me. This is about Emma, Jacob, and Sophia. This is about making sure they're safe. even if it means they and Daniel might hate me for my intervention. What I didn't expect was how quickly events would unfold. 3 days after filing the report, my doorbell rang at 7:30 in the evening. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, alone, looking haggard and tense. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough, as if he'd been shouting or crying. I stepped back wordlessly, hardly daring to believe he was really there, after nearly a year of separation. He walked into my living room and stood awkwardly, as if unsure of his welcome in the house where he'd grown up. "CPS came to the house today," he said without preamble. "They interviewed each of us separately, me, Jessica, even the kids." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "They asked about bruises, about scary anger, about feeling safe at home. Jessica is convinced you called them. Did you?" I took a deep breath. "Yes," I admitted, seeing no point in lying. After what happened at Walgreens, after what I've observed over the past year, after what Jacob's teacher told me, yes, I made the call. I expected anger, accusations, perhaps even for him to storm out. Instead, he sank onto my sofa, put his head in his hands, and began to sob, deep wrenching cries that seemed to come from his very core. I sat beside him, hesitantly placing a hand on his back, feeling the shudders that ran through him. "I've made such a mess of everything," he said when he could speak again. "I thought I was protecting them, my family, my marriage, but I've just been enabling something destructive. Do you know what Emma told the caseworker? That she practices being extra good so mommy won't yell at Jacob and Sophia. She's 7 years old, Mom, 7, and she thinks it's her job to protect everyone." Fresh tears flowed as he spoke, his voice breaking. "Daniel," I said gently, "what's been happening in that house? Really happening?" He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "Jessica has issues, control issues, anger issues. They were always there, I think. But after Sophia was born, after her business took off, it got worse. She needs everything perfect, everything her way. The slightest deviation, a toy out of place, a spill, a question she doesn't want to answer can trigger this rage that's frightening." He swallowed hard. "I've been telling myself it's just stress, just high standards, that it's not really affecting the kids. But today, hearing what they told the caseworker, he couldn't continue." "Why didn't you reach out?" I asked, trying to keep accusation from my voice. "Why shut me out when you needed support?" Daniel's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Jessica convinced me you were the problem, that your interference was undermining her authority, confusing the children, causing her stress that triggered her anger. If only you respected her rules, she'd be calmer, happier, a better mother." He shook his head in disbelief at his own naivety. And I believed her, or pretended to, because it was easier than admitting my wife needed help I didn't know how to give, that my children were walking on eggshells in their own home. We talked for hours that night about the isolation that had happened gradually, about Jessica's need for control that extended to every aspect of their lives, about the children's strategies for avoiding Mummy's bad days. Daniel showed me text messages Jessica had sent him over the past year, dozens, sometimes hundreds per day, monitoring his whereabouts, his conversations, his loyalty to her version of reality. "She checks the mileage on my car," he confessed. "Calls my office multiple times if I don't answer immediately. Questions the children about what I say to them when she's not around." "Daniel," I said finally, when the clock showed it was past midnight, "this isn't just controlling behavior. This sounds like emotional abuse of you and the children. Have you considered taking them somewhere safe while Jessica gets help?" He nodded warily. "The CPS worker suggested the same thing. She's given us 3 days to create a safety plan before they decide whether to open a formal case. Jessica is furious about the whole thing, convinced it's a conspiracy against her, that you've poisoned everyone against her, that I've betrayed her by even discussing family matters with outsiders." "What are you going to do?" I asked, dreading his answer. Daniel squared his shoulders, and for the first time that evening, I glimpsed the strong, determined man beneath the beaten-down exterior. "I'm going to protect my children," he said firmly. "I've already called a lawyer. Tomorrow, I'm taking the kids to my sister Amy's house while Jessica decides if she's willing to get the help she needs. CPS is supportive of this plan, and if Jessica refuses to cooperate," he took a deep breath, "then I'll file for emergency custody." My son left around 1 a.m., headed not home but to a hotel for the night. "I just need space to think clearly," he explained, without Jessica's voice in my ear telling me what to believe. We hugged goodbye, a real embrace, not the stiff, awkward thing our interactions had become in recent years. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, "for believing the worst of you, for keeping you from the kids, for everything." I held him tightly, this grown man who would always be my child. "We'll get through this," I promised. All of us. Together. What I didn't know as I watched him drive away was that Jessica had been tracking his phone's location, that she had seen he was at my house for hours, that she was already crafting a narrative about my manipulation of her vulnerable husband, about my orchestration of the CPS investigation, about my campaign to destroy her family. I didn't know that by morning, she would have filed for an emergency protective order against me, claiming I was a danger to her and her children. I didn't know that we were heading for a courtroom confrontation that would determine not just my relationship with my grandchildren, but the very structure of their family going forward. The protective order was delivered by a sheriff's deputy the next morning, a temporary measure prohibiting me from contacting Jessica or the children pending a hearing. Daniel wasn't named in the order, a deliberate omission that told me Jessica still believed she could bring him back under her control. I called my son immediately, frantic that this would derail his plans to move the children to safety. "I already have them at Amy's," he assured me. "Jessica doesn't know yet. She thinks they're at school and I'm at work. My lawyer says her protective order against you doesn't affect my right to make decisions about the kids' welfare." Relief flooded me, followed quickly by concern about Jessica's reaction when she discovered what Daniel had done. "Be careful," I urged. "If she's escalating to legal maneuvers this quickly, there's no telling what she might do next." Daniel's voice was grim. "I know. That's why I didn't go home last night. That's why the kids are with Amy now, not me. I'm trying to keep everyone safe while we figure this out." Over the next 72 hours, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Jessica discovered the children were with Amy and tried to forcibly remove them, resulting in a distressing scene that required police intervention. She filed additional legal motions against Daniel for parental kidnapping, against Amy for custodial interference, against me for alienation of affection and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each was more desperate and less grounded in reality than the last. Daniel, with the support of his lawyer and the preliminary findings from CPS, obtained an emergency temporary custody order for the children. Jessica was limited to supervised visitation until a full hearing could be held. She refused to attend the first supervised visit, instead sending her lawyer with a list of demands that had to be met before she would see her children in a hostile environment. Through all of this, I maintained my distance as required by the protective order, getting updates from Daniel and occasionally Amy but having no direct contact with my grandchildren. It was agonizing to know they were going through such turmoil without being able to offer comfort. But I trusted Daniel was providing the stability and reassurance they needed. "They ask about you," he told me during one of our daily calls. "Emma wants to know when they can come to your house for cookies. Jacob keeps talking about showing you his new drawings." Sophia, his voice caught. "Sophia carries around this little bird figurine she found at Amy's. She says it reminds her of your backyard birds." The hearing for Jessica's protective order against me was scheduled for 8 days after it was issued, a standard timeline for such cases. Daniel's lawyer arranged for my representation, connecting me with a family law attorney named Melissa Goldberg who specialized in grandparent rights. "This protective order is on shaky ground," Melissa assured me after reviewing the case. "There's no evidence of any threat or harm from you to Jessica or the children. In fact, we have substantial evidence to the contrary that your concern for the children's welfare was well-founded and validated by CPS," she explained. "That our strategy would be simple: present the facts, demonstrate my positive relationship with my grandchildren, and show the court that Jessica's allegations were retaliatory rather than protective in nature. There is one piece of evidence I think could be particularly powerful," Melissa added, "if Daniel is willing to provide it." When she explained what she had in mind, I felt a mix of hope and apprehension. It might indeed be powerful, but it would also be deeply personal, potentially painful for Daniel to share. "I'll ask him," I promised, "but I won't pressure him. He's carrying enough right now." To my surprise, when I called Daniel that evening and relayed Melissa's suggestion, he didn't hesitate. "I've already been thinking along similar lines," he admitted. "It's time for the whole truth to come out. no matter how difficult. The next day, he delivered a sealed envelope to Melissa's office inside. A handwritten letter he'd composed over 3 sleepless nights while staying at a hotel, wrestling with the reality of his marriage and his role in allowing the situation to deteriorate so far. Use it however you need to, he told Melissa. I'll be there to back it up in person. The morning of the hearing arrived, the morning I described at the beginning of this story. I dressed carefully in a conservative navy dress and low heels, determined to project the image of the stable, loving grandmother I had always tried to be. Melissa met me at the courthouse steps, projecting confidence as we navigated through security and found the designated family courtroom. Daniel was already there, sitting with his own attorney, offering me a tight smile of encouragement as I took my seat at the respondent's table. Jessica arrived with her lawyer just minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. She looked polished and composed in a cream-colored suit, but there was a brittleness to her demeanor, a tightly wound quality that seemed ready to snap. She didn't acknowledge my presence, keeping her eyes fixed forward as she whispered intently to her attorney. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Eleanor Reynolds, entered and called the court to order, reviewing the case file with efficient movements. We're here on the matter of Anderson versus Wilson, petition for a permanent protective order, Judge Reynolds stated. I've reviewed the filings from both parties. Mrs. Anderson, your attorney may present your case first. Jessica's lawyer stood, a man in an expensive suit who spoke with practiced gravity about my pattern of interference and escalating attempts to undermine his client's parental authority, culminating in my malicious report to Child Protective Services designed to damage her reputation and separate her from her children. He painted a picture of Jessica as a devoted mother being victimized by a controlling mother-in-law who couldn't accept appropriate boundaries. When it was Melissa's turn, she approached the matter differently. Your Honor, she began, rather than making accusations, we would like to present facts and witnesses who can speak to Mrs. Wilson's character and to the reality of the situation that prompted her legitimate concern for her grandchildren's welfare. She called Daniel first, a strategic choice that clearly surprised Jessica, whose expression faltered for the first time. Daniel testified calmly about the changes in Jessica's behavior over the years, the isolation from family and friends, the controlling behaviors that had escalated to frightening outbursts directed at the children. He described specific incidents: Jacob's untreated wrist injury, Emma's strategies to protect her siblings, Sophia's fear of mommy's scary voice. He admitted his own failure to intervene earlier, to recognize the harmful patterns, to protect the children from an increasingly volatile environment. And how do you view your mother's actions in reporting these concerns to authorities? Melissa asked. Daniel looked directly at me as he answered. She did what I should have done months ago. She put the children's safety above everything, above relationships, above comfort, above the status quo. I was too close to see clearly, too compromised to act. She saw the danger and had the courage to step in when I didn't. Jessica's attorney tried to paint Daniel as being under my influence, suggesting I had manipulated him into taking the children and supporting my false narrative. But Daniel's testimony remained consistent, supported by the preliminary CPS report which Melissa entered into evidence. Jacob's teacher testified via affidavit about her observations and concerns. Even the Walgreens employee who had witnessed Jessica's public outburst provided a written statement describing her disproportionate anger and concerning behavior toward the elderly woman and the child in her care. As our case built, Jessica became increasingly agitated, whispering furiously to her lawyer, passing notes, shaking her head in visible disagreement. When the judge called a brief recess, I overheard her hissing to her attorney, "This is all her doing. She's poisoned everyone against me. You need to shut this down." The attorney looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing the case wasn't proceeding as expected. When court resumed, Melissa played her final card. Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence that we believe is relevant to these proceedings. With the court's permission, Mrs. Wilson would like to read a document provided by Mr. Anderson. Judge Reynolds nodded her permission, and I approached the witness stand, taking the sealed envelope Melissa handed me. Inside was Daniel's letter, the one he had spent 3 nights writing, the one that contained his unfiltered truth about what had been happening in his home. I unfolded the pages, my hands trembling slightly as I adjusted my reading glasses. The courtroom was completely silent as I began to read. To whom it may concern, My name is Daniel Anderson. I am writing this statement of my own free will, without coercion or influence. What follows is the truth about my marriage to Jessica Anderson and the events that led to our current situation. For nearly 8 years, I have been living in an emotionally abusive relationship. The abuse was gradual, insidious, difficult to identify for what it was, even as it happened to me. It began with small controls, checking my phone, questioning my whereabouts, expressing disapproval of certain friendships. I interpreted these as signs of love, of interest in my life. I was wrong. After our first child was born, the control extended to parenting decisions. Jessica positioned herself as the authority on all matters related to our daughter. Any suggestion or question from me was framed as undermining her. Again, I rationalized this. She was a hands-on mother, researching everything, creating systems and routines. I told myself her intensity was dedication. I was wrong again. With each child, the control tightened. Jessica's need for perfection in our home, in our social image, in our children's behavior became overwhelming. Nothing was ever good enough. A spot on a shirt, a toy left out, a question asked at the wrong moment to any of these could trigger what we began calling her bad days. On bad days, Jessica would scream, threaten, demean, and intimidate. The children learned to be invisible on bad days. I learned to absorb her anger, to deflect it from them when possible. My mother, Margaret Wilson, was the first person to express concern about what she was witnessing. During a holiday party at our home, she noticed our son Jacob had injured his wrist. She correctly identified it as a possible fracture that needed medical attention. Jessica had dismissed the injury and forbade discussion of it. When my mother texted me about her concern, Jessica intercepted the message and used it as justification to cut my mother out of our lives completely. I allowed this to happen. I stood by as Jessica created arbitrary rules about when and how my mother could interact with our children. I endorsed her decision to cancel our traditional Christmas celebration, accepted her characterization of my mother as interfering and undermining. I betrayed the woman who raised me alone after my father's death, who supported me through every challenge, who loved my children unconditionally, all because it was easier than confronting the truth about my marriage. The truth is this: Jessica's controlling behavior escalated to emotional abuse of our children. She berated them for normal childhood behaviors, made them feel responsible for her emotional state, isolated them from family who loved them, and created an environment of fear and instability in our home. Emma, at 7 years old, has taken on the role of protector for her siblings, warning them when mommy is in a bad mood, distracting Jessica when her anger builds, sacrificing her own childhood to manage an adult's volatile emotions. Jacob, at 5, believes he deserves punishment for being careless or bad, terms Jessica uses for normal, developmental behaviors like spilling a drink or forgetting to put away a toy. Sophia, at just 3, has learned to freeze completely when Jessica raises her voice, becoming so still and quiet, it's as if she's trying to disappear. I watched all of this happen and told myself it wasn't that bad, that all families have tensions, that Jessica was just stressed from balancing work and motherhood. I made excuses when teachers raised concerns, when friends stopped inviting us over, when my sister Amy told me directly that she was worried about the children. I convinced myself that maintaining our family image, successful, affluent, enviable, was more important than addressing the reality behind closed doors. When my mother filed a report with Child Protective Services, my first reaction was anger and betrayal. How dare she interfere in our family? Who was she to judge our parenting? But when the caseworker interviewed our children, when I heard their responses, when I saw the evidence through objective eyes, I finally accepted the truth I had been avoiding for years. Jessica needs help, professional help that I cannot provide, that the children cannot compensate for with their compliance and fear. And until she acknowledges this need and commits to change, our children are not safe in her unrestrained care. I am not blameless in this situation. My silence, my compliance, my willingness to sacrifice my children's emotional safety for the sake of peace, these are failures I will spend the rest of my life trying to make right. But I am breaking that silence now. I am choosing truth over comfort, courage over complicity. My mother's actions, far from being malicious or interfering, were the actions of someone who recognized danger when others, myself included, were too close to see it clearly. She reported her concerns through proper channels, based on observed behaviors and professional judgment from her years as a nurse. She acted out of love for her grandchildren, even knowing it might permanently damage her relationship with me and them. This protective order against her is not about safety, it is about retaliation. It is Jessica's attempt to punish my mother for exposing truths that are uncomfortable and damaging to the perfect image Jessica works so hard to maintain. It is about silencing the one person who consistently put the children's welfare above social appearances and family dynamics. I ask that this protective order be dismissed, and that my mother be permitted to resume her relationship with her grandchildren. They need her stability, her unconditional love, her model of gentle strength now more than ever. And I need her forgiveness, her guidance, as I work to rebuild a safe and healthy environment for the children we both cherish. With complete sincerity, Daniel Anderson. The silence in the courtroom as I finished reading was absolute. I looked up, meeting Jessica's gaze for the first time that day. The hostility in her eyes had been replaced by something else, shock perhaps, or the dawning realization that her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. Judge Reynolds cleared her throat. "Mr. Anderson," she addressed my son directly, "do you confirm that this letter represents your testimony under oath?" Daniel stood. "I do, Your Honor, every word." Jessica's attorney requested a brief recess to confer with his client, which the judge granted. When they returned, there was a visible change in Jessica's demeanor. The brittle defensiveness had collapsed into something subdued, almost defeated. Her attorney addressed the court. "Your Honor, in light of the testimony presented today, my client wishes to withdraw her petition for a protective order against Mrs. Wilson." Judge Reynolds nodded. "Petition dismissed." She looked directly at Jessica. "Mrs. Anderson, while that resolves the immediate matter before this court, I strongly encourage you to take seriously the issues raised here today. The family court takes children's welfare as its highest priority, and the concerns expressed about your home environment warrant attention." She turned to Daniel. "Mr. Anderson, your temporary custody arrangement remains in effect until your scheduled hearing next week. I expect both parents to prioritize the children's well-being above all other considerations. As you navigate this difficult situation," with a final rap of her gavel, it was over. As we gathered our things to leave, I watched Jessica collect her purse and papers, her movements mechanical, her face devoid of expression. She walked past me without acknowledgement, her head bowed low enough that her chin nearly touched her chest. The fight had gone out of her, at least temporarily. Whether that meant she was ready to acknowledge her need for help, or was simply regrouping for the next battle, I couldn't tell. Daniel joined me in the hallway outside the courtroom, engulfing me in a hug that felt like coming home after a long absence. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for not giving up on us." Over his shoulder, I saw Jessica standing alone near the elevator, watching our embrace with an unreadable expression before the doors opened and she disappeared inside. "What happens now?" I asked as we walked toward the parking lot. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture. "Now, we try to heal. All of us, including Jessica, if she's willing. The children are safe with Amy for the moment. But that's temporary. We have the custody hearing next week. My lawyer thinks I'll get primary custody, with Jessica having supervised visitation until she completes its psychological evaluation and any recommended treatment. And after that," I pressed gently, "what's your hope for the future?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering. "My hope is that Jessica gets the help she needs, that she finds a way back to the person I fell in love with, someone passionate and vibrant but not volatile and controlling. I hope that children can have a relationship with both parents without fear or anxiety. I hope." He looked at me with a sad smile. "I hope we can all sit around a table together someday, you, me, the kids, and a healthier version of Jessica share a meal where no one is walking on eggshells." It was a beautiful vision, though whether it was achievable remained to be seen. What I knew for certain was that truth had finally broken through the carefully constructed facade, and with truth came the possibility of genuine healing. The path ahead wouldn't be easy for any of us, especially the children, but at least we were no longer pretending everything was fine, when it so clearly wasn't. That was 6 months ago now. Much has changed since that day in court. Daniel was granted primary custody of the children, with Jessica initially limited to supervised visitation twice weekly. She resisted at first, missing visits and fighting the court's requirements for therapy, but something shifted. After about a month, perhaps reality finally sank in, or perhaps she hit her own personal bottom. Whatever the catalyst, Jessica entered an intensive outpatient program for emotional regulation and control issues. She began attending the required therapy sessions, both individual and parent-focused. The children have been in therapy to play therapy for Jacob and Sophia, more traditional counseling for Emma. They live with Daniel in a new house, smaller than the showcase home Jessica had insisted on, but warm and comfortable, and full of evidence of actual children living their artwork on the refrigerator. Toys sometimes left on the couch, cookie crumbs occasionally found between cushions. I visit regularly, helping with school pickups and weekend activities, baking the promised cookies, pointing out birds in the backyard feeder I helped them install. Slowly, cautiously, Jessica has been making progress. Her supervised visits have gone well enough that last month, the court approved her first overnight visit with the children, a carefully structured Saturday sleepover at her new apartment, which is closer to Daniel's house than to the old family home she could no longer afford to maintain on her own. Emma reported that Mommy didn't get scary even once, which both broke my heart with its implicit acknowledgement of past fear and gave me hope that real change was possible. Daniel and I have had many long conversations about the years of isolation, about the red flags we both missed or ignored, about how to ensure the children grow up understanding that love doesn't control or isolate or frighten. I keep thinking about your kitchen, he told me recently, as we sat at his table, watching the children play in the backyard. When I looked confused, he elaborated, that sage green paint you've kept all these years. You said once that some things you hold on to, even when everything changes around you. I think that's what I missed in my marriage, the solid core of what matters, the values you hold on to regardless of circumstances. Jessica wanted the external, the perfect house, the social status, the enviable image, but she kept changing the rules, moving the goalposts. Nothing was ever enough. The sage green paint in my kitchen, a detail I'd mentioned months ago when I began this story. It seems fitting to return to it now as I conclude, a reminder that some things remain constant even through the most turbulent changes. My love for my son and grandchildren, my belief in truth as the foundation for healing, my hope that even the most broken relationships can find some measure of repair when all parties commit to honest growth. Is Jessica capable of that growth? I don't know yet. There are promising signs mixed with concerning ones. Her therapist reports progress, but she still struggles with accepting full responsibility for the harm her behavior caused. She's learning new ways to manage her emotions, but old patterns emerge under stress. The children are cautiously rebuilding their relationship with her, but Emma especially remains watchful, protective of her siblings, even when told repeatedly that it's not her job. What I do know is this: speaking truth, even when it's painful, even when it risks relationships, is sometimes the only path to genuine healing. If I had remained silent about what I was witnessing, if I had prioritized family harmony over children's safety, if I had chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, where would we be today? Would my grandchildren still be living in fear? Would Daniel still be making excuses for the inexcusable? Would Jessica's untreated issues have escalated to even more dangerous levels? I don't regret making that call to Child Protective Services. I don't regret standing in that courtroom and reading Daniel's letter aloud. I don't regret being the one to say what others wouldn't or couldn't. Sometimes love means being willing to be the villain in someone else's story, if that's what it takes to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And you, listening to my story now, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Would you have convinced yourself it wasn't your business? Or would you have found the courage to speak up, even knowing the potential cost? If there's someone in your life who needs you to be their voice right now, a child, an elderly parent, anyone vulnerably, hope my story gives you strength. The price of silence is far too high when safety and well-being are at stake. If you know someone facing a similar situation with a controlling family member, please share this story with them. Save it for those moments when you need to remember that speaking truth, however difficult, is sometimes the most loving action you can take. And if you've been moved by what you've heard today, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own experience. Subscribe If you'd like to hear more stories about finding courage in difficult family situations, I'm recording this from my kitchen, yes, with those sage green walls that have witnessed so much over the years. Some things you hold on to, even when everything else changes around you. Truth, love, courage, these are worth holding on to, no matter what storms come your way.